through Scripture, tradition, and the Catechism. And now, your host, Jim Havens.
It is great to be back with you on The Simple Truth, where we proclaim the life-giving reality of Jesus and His Catholic Church. We consecrate everything to the Sacred Heart of Jesus through the Immaculate Heart of Mary and the pure, strong heart of St. Joseph. Our guest today is Josh Craddock. We are very blessed to have him with us. He is an affiliated scholar with the James Wilson Institute on Natural Rights and the American Founding. He graduated magna cum laude from the Harvard Law School, where he served as editor-in-chief of the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy. He later clerked for the Honorable Chief Judge Timothy M. Timkovich of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit. In 2017, Josh wrote, "Protecting Prenatal Persons, Does the 14th Amendment Prohibit Abortion?" published in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, May 2017. You can learn more about him and his good work by going to his website, joshcraddock.com. And we are blessed to have him once again. Josh Craddock, thank you so much for being with us today. How are you?
Jim, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me on the show today.
Absolutely. Well, we've been big fans of you and your work here for a while, bringing it to light for our audience the best we can, especially on our Fridays with Father episodes with our co-host every Friday, Father Stephen Imbarado. And, as I read through your work, also the amicus brief with Robert George and John Finnis that was put in for the Dobbs case and all that transpired there, a terrific brief there, but all really stemming from this work of yours, Protecting Prenatal Persons, Does the 14th Amendment Prohibit Abortion? I know there are others working on this as well, but highly encourage folks to read what you have written here. You lay it out in such a smooth and simple, easily digestible way, pretty easily digestible for us non-lawyers. And but at the same time, this is bringing forth a simple truth that seems to be hiding in plain sight. In the briefest possible description, how would you describe that truth, that simple truth that you are bringing forth here?
Sure. Well, the 14th Amendment, which was adopted in 1868, it says that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, or deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. And the Constitution, which refers there to any person, it's actually referring to any human being. Just in the normal, right, philosophical sense, we understand that every human being is a person. It turns out is actually true in law as well. And so as I researched the history of the 14th Amendment and the use of the word person, it became clear to me that unborn children were clearly encompassed within that word person and are entitled to the equal protection of the laws, so that no state can discriminate against unborn children by denying them the protection of generally applicable homicide laws. So the bottom line, in a nutshell, is that the Constitution prohibits states from allowing abortion if you actually look back at the original meaning of the 14th Amendment.
This is, again, phenomenal. The implications of this are massive in this time where we have this ongoing daily mass murder of the preborn in our own country, the United States, by the thousands every day, hundreds of thousands around the world every day. And so, yes, we know this truth. It's a scientific truth that life begins at conception, fertilization. We know this foundational moral principle. We ought not be going around killing innocent human people. That ought to be illegal. And so we know these things. Every human being is a human person. These ought to be aspects of common sense. These ought to be things that we see very, very clearly. They've been so obscured, though, over the decades, especially since Roe, but even in the political upheaval and cultural upheaval leading up to Roe. But when you go back and you look at the arguments that you put forth, that this was not always the case. This confusion was not always around. It was quite clear at the time of the 14th Amendment, and even much before the 14th Amendment, leading up to it, that everybody understood this, that there would be some distinctions that would be a little bit different. Let me ask you about one of those, and that is this distinction about quickening. So some of the laws, the older laws that were on the books, they did not yet have that scientific determination, the language to be able to say life begins at conception, fertilization. They would say the first discernible time that we can tell is this time that the mom would feel the sense that she's pregnant pregnant by this quickening, this life within her. And so that's what they were using. Now, that's not disparaging human life beginning at conception fertilization. That's actually pointing to upholding it once we have that scientific evidence. Can you explain a little bit more on that?
Yeah, sure. So that's, in my article that was published in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, I used kind of 3 lines of evidence about that original meaning of the word person. And the first one that you kind of are alluding to is that common law history and state practice with respect to abortion leading up to the 14th Amendment. Now, at common law, the English common law tradition, which the United States inherited and developed after its independence, consistently treated the unborn child as a person whenever it would be for his or her benefit. So at common law, abortion was an unlawful act at all stages of pregnancy, and then was criminally indictable as soon as the child's life could be detected, either once the child was quick, that is alive, or at what came to be known quickening, which was often first perceived fetal movement. And I think the best resource for kind of understanding this doctrinal ambiguity or development is to look at that amicus brief that was filed by professors Robert George of Princeton and John Finnis of Oxford and Notre Dame. They do a great job of kind of teasing out this common law distinction and how the original meaning of quick, right, the child who is alive in the womb, was later developed and somewhat perverted by some later court decisions to mean quickening, which was first perceived fetal movement. And there's some debate about what quickening was, but I think it's ultimately unimportant because, in short, there were some archaic views of human generation that held sway in the mid-19th century, and those misperceptions led some courts to leave reform of the common law abortion offense to make abortion indictable prior to quickening, and it left that decision to legislators. Now, even though every living embryo was a quick child, some courts used quickening as a useful evidentiary tool for determining whether the crime of abortion had occurred, right? Because there was a lot of difficulty at that time in proving that the child was alive prior to quickening. And proving that the child was in fact alive was necessary to proving the crime of abortion. So when embryologists discovered in the 1830s that each human individual begins his or her life cycle at fertilization, the states were actually rapidly discarding the quickening standard, understood as first perceived fetal movement, in favor of the better medically accurate fertilization standard. And that was true both as a matter of common law and as a matter of statutory reform. So between 1820 and 1880, there was a widespread statutory reform movement that took that common law prohibition against abortion, right, which, as we said, was applicable at all stages of pregnancy, and made that a statute to prohibit abortion at all stages of pregnancy. And actually, by the time that the 14th Amendment was adopted and ratified in 1868, 23 states and 6 territories referred to the fetus as a child in their anti-abortion statutes. 28 listed abortion as among their statutory offenses against the person, or a functionally equivalent classification. And so it's very widely understood in these statutes and at common law that the unborn child is a person, is a child, is an infant at all stages of pregnancy. And so actually 20 years before the 14th Amendment was adopted, there's a great quote from Chief Justice Tenney of the Maine Supreme Court. And he reported that, quote, "The quickening distinction has been abandoned by jurists in all countries where an enlightened jurisprudence exists in practice." So as much as the other side likes to point out these ambiguities about quickening, they're ultimately immaterial to whether the unborn child was a person, because it was clearly established by the time the 14th Amendment was adopted and ratified that the unborn child was a person deserving of protection.
Yeah, outstanding. And, it's the go-to for folks like Nancy Pelosi. When she's asked about this, she'll start garbling some things about St. Thomas Aquinas and quickening. Well, the fact is that, again, it's all pointing to, and this is, again, so far before Roe. At the time of Roe, they would have known scientifically that life begins at conception, fertilization. They would have known that for a very long time, even though the justices in ruling on Roe, they punted on that, and they punted on the question of whether the child in the womb is a person or not, or is a scientifically a human being from conception, fertilization. They don't really talk about that, or they say we can't. You'll tell us the language what they use, but it's something along the lines of we can't know that right now, even though absolutely they could, and for a long time. And so that had been going on for quite a while, that we would know that when people are saying quick or quickening way back when, what they're saying is simply the earliest time that you would know that there is a child there, which when the scientific evidence comes around and we can know scientifically that this is life begins at conception, fertilization, well, then that becomes the earliest time. Anything further on that in regard to the science and what Roe left out?
Well, that's all consistent with Blackstone, right? For whom there was no distinction between biological human life and legal personhood. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but Blackstone was the widely influential treatise writer and commentator who, at the American founding, every lawyer would have had a copy of Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England on his shelf. And actually, if you crack open a copy of the commentaries, Blackstone's first section of the commentaries is on the rights of persons. And he actually begins that section with a discussion of the rights of the unborn child to life and personal security, if you can believe it. So Blackstone wrote that natural persons are such as the God of nature formed us, and life is a right inherent by nature in every individual. And it begins in contemplation of law as soon as an infant is able to stir in the mother's womb. So this mention of the unborn child stirring was intended to protect prenatal life as soon as it could be detected.
So much more to get to today with Josh Craddock. But I do want to encourage you can learn more by going to his website, joshcraddock.com. Also, again, his work, the paper that he wrote, Protecting Prenatal Persons, Does the 14th Amendment Prohibit Abortion? Nothing like reading that in its fullness. So highly encourage you to do that as well. But we're going to continue to break that down here today. And there's a lot that we're going to get to that is vitally important. Pray for us as we go to the break that we pull out the most important points for you, but that's what our attempt is here today. We're going to be right back on The Simple Truth. Stay tuned.
Hello, this is Steve Gleason with your 1-minute tool for Catholic evangelism. Here's the question for your non-Catholic friend. Can you really say you know what praying the rosary is all about? So here's your 3 best friendship tools for Catholic evangelism. Number 1, listen to the who's who of the rosary. We have the Blessed Trinity, we have the Angel Gabriel, we have the Virgin Mary, we have John the Baptist, and we have Elizabeth. So how's that for a cast of sacred ones? Secondly, reflection. While saying the rosary, we reflect on 20 primary and sacred moments that occur in the lives of the Holy Family. And thirdly, the rosary dynamics. Here's how you involve this cast of holy ones in praying the rosary. You first invoke the 3 persons of the Blessed Trinity, then on to praying the Apostles' Creed. Then you will pray in Our Father. Then you will recite the Angel Gabriel's words to Mary. Then you'll recite what Mary said to Elizabeth, and then you will relive John the Baptist being filled with the Holy Spirit in the womb. Then you will ask for Mary's assistance in your life, and I'm so glad to say none of that is idolatry.
As part of our efforts to teach the beauty of our faith, we're broadcasting a special educational lesson every Wednesday called Lessons in Latin. I'm Canon Bourgeois, a priest of the Institute of Christ the King, Sovereign Priest. These mini teachings break down the history of the various parts of the Holy Mass. You can hear Lessons in Latin on Wednesdays at approximately 5:15 a.m., 3:45 p.m., and 9:40 p.m. Eastern Time. That's Lessons in Latin Wednesdays at 5:15 a.m., 3:45 p.m., and 9:40 p.m. on the Station of the Cross Catholic Media Network.
Are you ready to take on the world of flesh and the devil with just the facts? This is Jesse Romero, host of Jesus 911, heard weekdays at 2 p.m. Eastern. I'm joined each day by a variety of co-hosts like Ruben Nava, Paul Clay, Dan Schneider, and my amazing wife, Anita Romero. We tackle Catholic devotions, spiritual warfare, family life, saving America, and everything in between. Join us each weekday at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific for Jesus 911. God bless you. Keep the faith.
Simple Truth. Jim Havens here with our guest today, Josh Craddock. He is an affiliated scholar with the James Wilson Institute on Natural Rights in the American Founding. He also wrote Protecting Prenatal Persons, Does the 14th Amendment Prohibit Abortion? This was published in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, May of 2017. Josh also graduated magna cum laude from Harvard Law School, where he served as editor-in-chief of the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy. So great stuff here to have him with us, helping us us to break down constitutional personhood for the preborn. What does it all mean? How do we understand it? What are the implications? JoshCraddock.com is where you can go for more information on Josh and his good work. Josh, I want to have you comment here on Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun in the Roe v. Wade decision, Doe v. Bolton, the companion decision as well. So at that time, again, a lot going on in the culture. I remember reading the book Subverted, and that book was a whistleblower letting us know about what was going on in that time. And some of what comes out in that book is that Blackmun really makes his decision really around the table with his wife and daughters, more so than really studying what the legal precedent was of the time and all of that. He based everything on this history that was false, a false history given to him by this fellow Means. Much of that coming from Larry Lader, who was a pro-abortion activist, co-founder of NARAL with Dr. Bernard Nathanson. So just a complete fabrication where they were drawing sort of the legal standards and precedents from. So it's taken 50 years to get to Dobbs, where that was all corrected. But anything you want to say about that? That seems to me to be a major point here that doesn't get enough attention. That Roe was all based on these lies that were very faulty from a legal standpoint. Some of that's been corrected in Dobbs in the Alito opinion, but still not ruling on this question, which again we'll get to in a moment, the constitutionality of the child in the womb being a person under the 14th Amendment. We'll talk about that more. But first, anything more on Blackmun and Roe, anything surrounding all that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And thanks again for having me on. It's so good to be here. The Roe opinion was a disaster, even as scholars who support abortion have acknowledged. And so much of its historical scholarship was based on articles by Cyril Means, who you just mentioned, one of which was written while he was the general counsel of the National Abortion Rights Action League. And that was, advocacy work. It was not neutral scholarship, and it's been disproven over decades of just the fabrications and misstatements of the historical evidence that Means put into those articles. One thing that I think is very interesting, you mentioned Blackmun kind of sitting around the table writing this. He always wanted to be a doctor, not really a lawyer. And so, he always envisioned this as being about doctors and all of that. And so he was susceptible to these historical arguments. But one thing that I think is interesting about the Roe case is that during initial arguments for Roe, Texas actually argued to the court that the fetus is a person within the language and meaning of the 14th Amendment. That's a quote. And so the Supreme Court, when they rejected that argument and ruled that the word person, as used in the 14th Amendment, does not include the unborn, Justice Blackmun made an admission. And he said that if prenatal personhood is established, the case for abortion, quote, collapses, for the fetus's right to life would be then guaranteed specifically by the 14th Amendment. So even Justice Blackmun, when he was writing Roe v. Wade, recognized that if the unborn child is a person, then no state could deny equal protection of the laws to those unborn persons by denying the equal and generally applicable protections that other persons have who are already born. And so I think that's an important admission that was made in the Roe case itself. In numerous cases after that, other Supreme Court justices agreed with that logic, Justice Stevens, for example, in later cases. And so there have actually been several Supreme Court justices who, even though they disagreed with the conclusion that the unborn child is a person because they advocated for abortion, they acknowledged that if the unborn child is a person, then no state would be allowed to deny the equal protection of the laws to those persons.
Yeah, Josh Craddock is with us, joshcraddock.com. So much running through my head in terms of questions to ask. Let me ask you about Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia, who's been this originalist lion on the court, and yet he was off on this one in terms of a real originalist reading of the text of the 14th Amendment. He wanted to talk about persons in the 14th Amendment, referring to so-called walking around persons. And so this is a difficult one because, again, you make the argument is out there, Robert George and John Finnis. I mean, the argument seems to me to be just rock solid. And yet when you have someone like Scalia who didn't really get that, he wasn't really there, that becomes maybe one of the most difficult things to overcome for us in making the argument, I guess, to people. They could say, well, Scalia didn't think that. Now, Scalia died February 2016. Your paper came out May 2017. Do you think that he had, that somebody put this full argument before him? Do you think he really thought all of it through? Did he have all the details before him as you lay them out, perhaps?
That's a great question. Justice Scalia is someone I admire so much for his work in the law and, so much that he accomplished as a Supreme Court justice. Obviously, this is something that I disagree with him strongly on. And I think it was something kind of interesting to note when I was researching for my paper that Justice Scalia made this point that the Constitution applies to what he called walking around persons. He made that in an interview, and most of his comments about this issue were made in interviews rather than in opinions. And so kind of the challenge that I laid out in my paper was, well, if that's the perspective, why not look at the historical evidence, right? If you espouse the interpretive philosophy of originalism, which is looking to the original public meaning of a document at the time it was enacted and determining its meaning on that basis, then we should be looking at those historical sources. And what was interesting to me is that in Justice Scalia's comments on this issue, he never actually went back to those historical sources and looked at that analysis. Now, this argument has been around for a long time, so I know Justice Scalia was familiar with it, but I don't think he was familiar with the depth of historical evidence that we have today, right? So back in 1973, the Americans United for Life brief by Charles Rice, late Charles Rice of Notre Dame Law School, he argued that the unborn child is a person within the meaning of the 14th Amendment. But since in that time, in the last 50 years, there's been this wealth of scholarship that has developed in this historical analysis. We've mentioned a few of those resources, right? You can look at my article to find some of that historical evidence. You can look at the amicus brief that was filed by Robbie George and John Finnis. Michael Stokes Paulson also wrote a great article in the in a law review arguing for the plausibility of personhood under the 14th Amendment, where he dug into a lot of this historical evidence. Cesar Bernstein, a new and upcoming scholar, is also looking into this and has argued that as a matter of public meaning, right, the commonly understood meaning of the amendment at the time it was adopted, it would have included the unborn. And so I think that you're starting to see this wealth of scholarship that's being developed based on the history. And I just don't think Justice Scalia ever really confronted that history. And I'm optimistic or hopeful that if he had been confronted with that historical evidence, he would have been consistent in his originalist interpretation to go where the evidence leads.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he seemed to be a proponent of putting it back to the states and letting states make up their minds on this. But he would not have been a proponent of doing the same thing with respect to an evil like slavery. So it just doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't seem to go together. I'm not sure why he didn't get there. I wish he would have. But what I do know is going through your paper, there were some points that jumped out like just incredibly enlightening moments. One is this. So the question is, this is what the simple aspect of this that we always kick around on Fridays with Father Imbarrato, and we're always trying to put out there, the simple aspect that, look, we know that every human being is a human person. The 14th Amendment, your scholarship shows quite clearly that it's talking about human persons protecting a wide interpretation of all human beings, including human life from conception, fertilization, and that this is the question that the Supreme Court has to answer. Fine, if Scalia or anybody else on the court says, whatever they want to say about it, but then put it into law as far as your opinion. Put it actually into the opinion. You have to rule on this. Just tell us. We just want to know, what is the ruling of the Supreme Court, are children in the womb considered to be human beings and human persons, or are they not? Are they protected under the 14th Amendment, or are they not? They refuse to answer the question, and yet it seems like this question was already answered by the Supreme Court. One of the light bulb moments in your paper was this for me. It says, certainly the framers of the amendment, meaning the 14th Amendment, did not promote an understanding of legal personhood separate from biological humanity. Indeed, they might have relied upon the long-established precedent set in United States v. Palmer, in which Chief Justice Marshall acknowledged that the terms person or persons were broad enough to include every human being and the whole human race. So this is John Marshall, an American founding father. He served as the fourth Chief Justice of the U.S. For the U.S., 1801 to 1835. So in this respect, this is way before even the 14th Amendment. Hasn't the Supreme Court, with regard to Marshall's ruling here, in some sense already defined personhood as being broad enough, including every human being?
Yeah, well, that's a great example. There's another, even just 5 years before Roe, there was another example in Levy versus Louisiana, where the court said that the Equal Protection Clause extends to all who are, quote, humans, live and have their being, right? In that case, they were specifically determining that the Equal Protection Clause prohibited invidious discrimination against children who are illegitimate, and rejecting the premise that such children are non-persons for 14th Amendment purposes. So you can look all the way back to John Marshall, our Chief Justice, who is widely influential on many areas of constitutional law. You can look even all the way up to the eve and the doorstep of Roe, where the Supreme Court recognized that the Equal Protection Clause included all living human beings within the jurisdictional reach and geographic scope of the Constitution. And so it's quite clear that for hundreds of years, this was the case, and the notable absence of the unborn children being protected by the Equal Protection Clause is really glaring when you look at Roe. And so thankfully Dobbs has overturned Roe, and it overturned both the holding that abortion is required by the 14th Amendment and the second holding of Roe, that children are not persons within the meaning of the 14th Amendment. But we haven't gotten a ruling from the Supreme Court yet identifying and recognizing unborn children as persons entitled to equal protection. And so my hope is that going forward from Dobbs, there's a few aspects of Dobbs that I find very encouraging. One aspect of Dobbs is the when the court is distinguishing other substantive due process cases. 5 times the Supreme Court distinguished those cases by observing that abortion is, quote, critically different from any other right that this court has held to fall within the 14th Amendment's protection of liberty, because it destroys what Roe and Casey called fetal life and what the Mississippi law before us describes as an unborn human being. So I think based on that repeated distinction of those other cases and abortion on the grounds that abortion is a unique act, I think it's central to the Dobbs holding is the unavoidable fact that abortion takes a human life. And I hope that moves us forward toward a new ruling that recognizes the unborn as persons.
Absolutely. We're very blessed to have Josh Craddock here with us. He's going to be with us when we get back. We are going to discuss more about the implications of Dobbs. We're also going to talk about what steps each branch of government can take to ensure equal protection of the preborn. There's a lot here that we're going to get to today that I think is going to be something that you've perhaps never heard before and yet be vitally important to you. We're going to be right back. Stay tuned.
This is Life News Radio. I'm Jim Anderson. Another pro-life candidate announced over the weekend their run for the White House. The growing company of pro-life Republican candidates may serve to point voters to the life issue as much as to personality. Governor Asa Hutchinson brings into his campaign a strong pro-life record as governor of Arkansas. Challenged by a GOP lawmaker, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin claimed that providing military abortions is both necessary and based on sound legal advice. Louisiana Representative Mike Johnson Tuesday said the move was a crafty workaround, but a blatant violation that is destined to lose in court. A federal court is hearing FACE Act charges against 2 activists for attacks on Florida pregnancy centers. It will now also hear a suit by Florida AG Ashley Moody for over $300,000 in monetary damages. This is Life News Radio. This week, as Christians remember the Passion of Christ, could be the week a federal judge terminates 30 years of expanding FDA approval of chemical abortion. Plaintiffs argue that the FDA, in violation of law, has categorized pregnancy as a sickness or disorder to be remedied by abortion. In other stories, while a complicated court fight over sanctuary cities begins in New Mexico, the state Supreme Court is blocking city ordinances restricting abortion. Some city bans simply demand compliance with federal law, banning the shipment of abortion drugs by U.S. mail. And the Spring 40 Days for Life completed its 40th day Sunday. People praying in Mount Vernon, Washington got news from parents who were helped in last fall's campaign. They delivered twins and have adopted one 40 Days volunteer as their local grandma. For pro-life headlines delivered to your email address daily, sign up at lifenews.com. This has been Life News Radio.
Welcome back to The Simple Truth. Jim Havens here with our guest today, Josh Craddock. Josh wrote Protecting Prenatal Persons. Does the 14th Amendment Prohibit Abortion? Published in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, May of 2017. You can check out his good work by going to joshcraddock.com. And we're very, again, blessed to have Josh with us today. And so let's get into Dobbs a little bit. And I guess I want to get into it this way. Again, the common sense understanding here is that it just doesn't all go together what the court has said with respect to not recognizing the personhood, the fact that every child in the womb is a human being from conception, fertilization. Every human being is a human person, and human persons are protected with a right to life under the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, to be sure. I mean, going all the way back to the Declaration of Independence, it's telling us here that some truths are self-evident, some rights are unalienable, and the right to life is one of those rights. And so, look, this is, I guess my question is that the Supreme Court on this, they've actually ruled already that the 14th Amendment, the word person in the 14th Amendment is so broad and expansive that they've included corporations under that term person. So let me get this right. They're trying to say that corporations are persons. They've ruled on that, but they're not telling us that all human beings are persons. They won't rule on that. So this is nonsense. I mean, the justices must know it. Again, Robbie George and John Finnis, they put forth the argument all there before them in the amicus brief that they gave them about constitutional personhood. It was not an argument that the counsel for the Dobbs case seemed to be wanting to make. They just seemed to want them to kick it back to the states. Even Alito seemed to be fishing around at certain portions, and I think it was the general counsel for the state of Mississippi seemed to say, no, we're not interested in that so much. Just can you just say that abortion's not a right, basically. And so there's been a two-part question here. What do you think about the Supreme Court right now? The folks that are on the Supreme Court, don't they already know the answer to this? Even though Scalia seemed a bit confused, maybe years now, they've had the amicus brief before them. They must know this. And then on the other hand, with all of this, is there some aspect with this that we just have to push harder to say that you need to rule on this and not be so afraid of it? Josh, your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question, Jim. And, we've been discussing equal protection for the preborn. I've been talking about some of my historical research and speaking, on my own behalf, not on behalf of any employer or client, but, speaking of the Supreme Court as it is now, I think there's a few key takeaways from Dobbs. And, I don't purport to know what the Supreme Court justices think of this equal protection argument. I do know that they generally follow a doctrine called party presentment. And so if a party, appealing a case to the Supreme Court doesn't make an argument, the Supreme Court generally won't opine on that issue if it's not necessary to decide the case. As you mentioned, the lawyers for Mississippi expressly disclaimed the equal protection argument. They said we weren't arguing for that. And so, that's another reason why the Supreme Court wouldn't necessarily go beyond the holding that they've been asked to reach, which is that which is a correct holding, that the 14th Amendment does not guarantee any constitutional right to an abortion. I think that there's a few breadcrumbs in the opinion, for all of its talk about states' rights and returning this issue to the states. I think that that's a necessary implication of the holding that there is no constitutional right to abortion if they're not going to reach the equal protection for the unborn argument. And so I think that's a necessary implication of the opinion, but it's not core or central to the principle of the holding. And in fact, what we were just discussing before the break about how the reasoning, the logic of distinguishing those other substantive due process cases from abortion, the court said that that's because abortion takes an unborn human life. And I think that another aspect that's very interesting in the court's approach is that they deeply rooted their decision in history. They were looking to state laws and common practice with respect to abortion leading up to the 14th Amendment's adoption. And the court found that the right to abortion is not deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition. They said in the opinion, until the latter part of the 20th century, there was no support in American law for a constitutional right to an abortion. No state constitutional provision had recognized such a right. And until a few years before Roe, no federal or state court had recognized such a right, nor had any scholarly treatise. Indeed, abortion had long been a crime in every single state. So that's a direct quote from the opinion. And I think that historical approach necessarily leads to the conclusion that I've advocated for, based on the history, based on the evidence, that unborn children are entitled to the full and equal protection of the laws as guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. And even though the drafters of the 14th Amendment weren't specifically concerned with the unborn when they were drafting it, right? Their specific intent and concern was the equal protection of freedmen in the former Confederacy in the South, right? Where these acts of extrajudicial violence were happening and lynchings, right? But the framers were smart. They didn't just limit the application of the 14th Amendment to freedmen. They specifically chose the broadest language possible. They said any person. No state shall deprive any person of the equal protection of the laws. And so they had an eye toward the future, and they knew that no disfavored minority group should be denied equal protection of the laws. And the states couldn't just stand on the sidelines and allow these extrajudicial acts of violence against a disfavored minority. And unfortunately, that's what we see happening with abortion in states like my home state of Colorado, or in states like New York and California after the Dobbs decision. And so right now, we are in a sort of free-for-all where each state is deciding its own abortion policy. But I don't think that that's a long-term viable option for America. And I think back to Abraham Lincoln's House Divided speech, where he said the United States is a house divided, and a house divided against itself cannot stand. It will either all become one thing or all the other, right? We will become all slave or all free. And I think that rings true today with respect to abortion. And so I'm optimistic that whether it's from a federal court ruling or an executive branch decision or a congressional action, I think that there will be a federal solution on this issue, securing the equal protection promise that was guaranteed 150 years ago to every person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Speak about some of those aspects that you mentioned there, but first, let me get your thought on this language leading into that, which is it fair to say, look, we've got an excluded class, the last excluded class, the child in the womb, and then at the same time, that also means, look, we've got a constitutional crisis here. Now, if we use that kind of a language, I think that helps us to help raise the urgency of the issue. If we can get that kind of language bubbling up, that we have a constitutional crisis here, they need to rule on this question. What are your thoughts on those, phrases, that use of language? And then also, what more can be done in terms of the different branches? We can break that open as well.
Yeah, I think that language is exactly right. And when you look back at the history of our Constitution, the story of that Constitution is the securing and guaranteeing of the inalienable rights and additional rights, right, to more and more members of the human family based on our notions of and better understanding of human equality and dignity. And so I think from that perspective, the omission of the unborn is notable. And I think that the violence of abortion is incompatible with those constitutional standards. and the motivating principle of our republic, which you mentioned a moment ago, which is the Declaration of Independence, which Lincoln called the apple of gold, right? And the Constitution is a silver frame around that apple of gold to secure those principles from the Declaration. And so I think that, from that perspective, the violence of abortion is incompatible with our constitutional guarantees and the soul of the American Republic as expressed in the Declaration of Independence. Now, you asked just a moment ago, getting into what each branch could do, right, to move the ball forward and to remedy the omission of the unborn from that equal protection guarantee. And I think that every branch and level of government has a role to play here, right? Obviously, right now, the states are paramount, and the states retain their duty to protect the inalienable rights of all the human beings within their jurisdictions. So states actually have a responsibility to exercise their police powers, which is to say their powers to promote public health, safety, and morals, to prohibit abortion. And so I think that state governors and legislators should do everything in their power to uphold the Constitution on that point. At the federal level, I think constitutionally, Congress should act under Section 5 of the 14th Amendment, which says that Congress can enforce by appropriate legislation the Constitution's protections and guarantees in Section 1. And so that's an enumerated power for Congress to act to prohibit abortion and to stop states from denying the equal protection of the laws. I recently co-authored an article with Professor George in the Washington Post that outlines the authority of Congress to pass this sort of legislation. But again, this idea is not new. In fact, the Republican Party platform going back to 1984 has called for legislation to make clear that the 14th Amendment's protections apply to children before birth. That's a direct quote from the platform. And so I think that needs to happen. We talked about the court. The court is important. And I think that the judiciary, federal court, any federal court confronting this issue has an obligation to apply the original meaning of the Equal Protection Clause to decide the cases and controversies that come before it. There's presently no binding precedent holding that unborn children lack personhood. So I believe that courts are free to recognize the 14th Amendment's protections, just as a 3-judge federal panel did in 1971 in the years before Roe. There was a 3-judge federal panel out of the Northern District of Ohio that, again, specifically distinguished other substantive due process cases from abortion on the grounds that abortion takes a human life. And then they went one step further and said every human being is a person from conception. And then I think the executive branch should follow Lincoln's example to interpret and uphold the Constitution, right? The president has a duty in Article 2 of the Constitution to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And so in order to faithfully execute the law to ensure equal protection for all, you first have to interpret what that means, right? The president swears an oath to preserve the Constitution of the United States, which entails an independent duty to interpret it so that it can be executed. I helped co-author an article called The Lincoln Proposal. It's published on the Americans United for Life website, and it kind of outlines what the steps would be for a pro-life president to instantiate equal protection through all the departments and agencies that are under the executive branch and what that would look like. So I think, again, every branch and level of government has a role to play to ensure equal protection for the preborn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, tell us about the litmus test that you would encourage with respect to the political process now going towards 2024. What do we need to see from the candidates that are stepping up on the Republican side and saying they're pro-life?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think it's enough to say you're pro-life. I think it has to be a commitment to ensuring equal protection for all, and including the preborn. So I would want to see that as a litmus test for candidates for public office to ensure that not only will they, in their capacity as an elected official, president, instantiate the equal protection guarantee, but also in consideration for appointments and nominations for various federal offices. I think that that's an important commitment that these candidates can make as well to ensure that their nominees and their appointees will also carry forward this vision of equal protection. Because if you're going to swear an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution, I think it has to include equal protection for all. And that should be the standard that we hold candidates to.
Absolutely, yeah. We've been following it. Nobody is checking that off yet, but that's what we need to encourage, and we need to be looking for that. What is your message to pro-life leaders right now, specifically those that maybe they've been aware of this to some degree, but they've said, well, the court's not ready. Maybe this was before Roe, before Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, but now don't we need to be pushing for this? Now there's a window. Who knows how long it is? The court seems to be favorable. We need to be pushing for this, but it seems like pro-life leadership isn't pushing too hard. They're getting caught up in smaller things. Anything? I know we've only got about 45 seconds before the break. Go ahead.
Well, I think that when the people lead, the leaders will follow. And so I think that, your audience can help lead this forward and demand of pro-life leaders to advance equal protection for the preborn as a North Star for the pro-life movement. And our next goal after securing victory in Dobbs is to ensure equal protection for the preborn.
And Josh Craddock is with us. He's going to be back with us for a final segment. I'm going to put the phone number out in case somebody wants to get a call in. Let's open up that phone line, 1-877-511-5483. That's 1-877-511-5483. One more segment with Josh Craddock when we get back. Stay tuned.
This Holy Week, let us slow down and focus on our Lord's passion through the eyes of Mary. Our Blessed Mother knew Jesus from his miraculous birth to his sorrowful death. The prophecy of Simeon predicted that Mary's own soul would be pierced with the sword, and how quickly the crowds turned from welcoming Jesus into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday to condemning him to death. We reflect on the fear Mary must have had hearing the crowds cry out, "Crucify him." Mary sees her son take up his cross and fall 3 times as she stands distressed, unable to help him. Our Lady watches as the robe she made for him is ripped from his flesh. Mary was the first one to hear Jesus say, "I thirst," and now she hears him cry out these words from the cross. Mourning, she receives her dead Jesus from the altar of the cross. She buries in death the son she gave birth to. O Mary, renew your motherhood to us now and at the hour of our death.
What you're offering and giving to me, you deserve to get back because you're offering more than I can give.
I learned so much through the Stations on the Cross. I listen to the radio station daily, and I absolutely love it.
I was attending the chapel and places like that, and through your programs, I was able to find out how other Protestants had come back into the Catholic Church. God bless the Station of the Cross.
Donate today at thestationofthecross.com.
Scripture in many places indicates to us the sad truth that yes, hell is not just a theoretical possibility, but a concrete possibility. Sadly, people do choose to go there. And St. Paul reminds us, do not be deceived. God is not mocked, for a person will reap only what he sows.
That's Sermons for Everyday Living, weekdays from 6 to 7 a.m. Eastern on the Station of the Cross.
Truth. Jim Havens here. Final segment here with Josh Craddock, our guest today. JoshCraddock.com. JoshCraddock.com for more information. Again, read his paper, Protecting Prenatal Persons. Does the 14th Amendment Prohibit Abortion? Published in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, May of 2017. We've been talking about it today, and a couple more questions to go. When reading this, one important aspect that comes out that I think people have been educated in a way that by pro-life leadership that is going to make some aspects of this difficult is they need to be re-educated in understanding that, look, if it is murder, if it's killing an innocent human being, and that's illegal, if that's made illegal, then there has to be penalties for that. Now, what that means is debatable. That has to be debated, but it's a crime, and a crime has to be enforced. In fact, Justice Blackmun, as you write, in this paper, in the Roe arguments, he makes it a point to say, well, one of the reasons that I'm concluding things the way I am is because nobody has ever there's not been a lot of enforcement, is what he was saying. Again, taking from fraudulent sort of legal and historical analysis, there actually was quite a bit of enforcement against abortion being a crime, and enforcing it as women who were part of this crime, that there would be an enforcement with respect to that. Now, as soon as you go there, that's something that the pro-life leadership really wants to run away from, not want to talk about it. But we need to understand the important distinctions, the nuances here, rather than just seeing the woman as a victim. Yes, there is a victim aspect to this, widely deceived on, we've got lies about that the human being is just a clump of cells in the womb. So, I mean, there's all kinds of lies going around, all kinds of deception, sure. But one of the points you bring out is that when this enforcement was taking place around the crime of abortion in the United States decades, centuries ago, what we had was looking at it and saying, okay, the woman, we can grant her some form of immunity. A lot of states did that if she's helpful in giving testimony against the abortionist. And so that was done oftentimes. And so there's a distinction here between the crime itself and the culpability in the crime, which is varying degrees. But there has to be some sort of legal aspect to the fact that this is a crime, it needs to be enforced, and the woman is part of committing this crime. I know people might be uncomfortable with that language, but we have to go there. We have to help people to understand these nuances and distinctions. Anything else you want to say on that?
Well, in my article, just speaking from a historical perspective, I point out that just because different states punished abortion differently, for example, doesn't mean that they, viewed abortion as anything less than a crime or the taking of a human life, right? So, there are certain, in law, we have for different crimes, for example, for in homicide crimes, you may have aggravating and mitigating circumstances, right? So in many states, if you murder a police officer, that's an aggravating factor that can cause higher punishment, right? Now, does that mean that we believe that police officers are more persons than anyone else? No, of course not, right? It's taking into consideration factors about culpability, right? And similarly, in many other instances, right, you might have mitigating circumstances where the punishment might be slightly different for mitigating circumstances. And as you pointed out, historically, women who sought abortion were treated with those mitigating circumstances. And also, they were often granted immunity because the most reliable testimony against these abortionists, who are basically serial killers, right, was the testimony of a woman who had seen that abortionist. And so whether, just speaking from a historical perspective, states often granted immunity for women who chose to testify, or a blanket immunity with the hope of inducing women to come forward to testify against these abortionists. And so that's kind of what the historical record shows. And I don't think it's, Blackstone's, Justice Blackmun's inference in the Roe v. Wade decision that just because different states treat punishments differently doesn't mean that the unborn child lacks personhood. That was an improper inference to draw from the facts and from the historical evidence. And in fact, when you go back to well-known Justice Shaw of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. He said in 1834 that the unborn human being throughout pregnancy is a person, and hence under civil and common law to all intents and purposes a child as much as if born. And so I think it's very clear, the personhood at the time, and drawing these improper inferences based on the historical record of, how states punished abortion was incorrect in Roe. And I think that even under equal protection, different states might have a margin of appreciation in how they instantiate that equal protection guarantee. But what a state cannot do is withdraw the equal protection of the laws from a certain disfavored minority. And it can't impose simply just nominal punishments on abortionists, for example, who perform abortion. Say like, well, if you perform an abortion, you're going to be punished a fine of $1, right? That would be facially discriminatory and a violation of equal protection. So even though there's a margin of appreciation in how states can deal with punishments for abortion. And I don't think there's necessarily a one-size-fits-all rule that's demanded by the Equal Protection Clause. There are clear guidelines within which states must operate. And it's clear that states must prohibit abortion, and there must be, some equivalence between the general homicide laws that apply to born persons as to unborn persons.
Mm-hmm. Outstanding. Yeah, Josh Craddock is with us. Anything else you want to say in order to encourage us who are in the grassroots on this? We want to stand up. We want to share these basic points, understand the simple language of this, go out and proclaim it in the public square. We want justices, judges, politicians, religious leaders. We want people that are more influential than us to hear this and to think that and to understand that they've got a lot of support on this. This is bubbling up in the grassroots, so it seems like we need to show them some numbers if we can. But what other encouragement might you have for us today?
Yeah, well, I just love everything that you're doing on this show to advance the equal protection argument. And I know that I've spoken about Lincoln a little bit, but I want to encourage your audience to draw inspiration from his debates with Stephen Douglas, because I think that provides a helpful lens through which to view our current debates about the constitutional right to life and states' rights. So some of your listeners might have heard, right, this idea that states have the right to decide whether or not to allow abortion. And I think that Lincoln, as a matter of political morality, teaches us that a democratic majority's authority is derived from nothing other than the equal natural rights of the persons who constitute it. So a majority can't ignore or disparage the humanity of others without vitiating its own legitimacy. Another way of putting that is saying that no democratic process can legitimately deny those inalienable rights with which the Creator has endowed his children, the foremost of which is the right to life. And I think it's appropriate to note on your show and to invoke St. John Paul II here, who wrote that authentic democracy is only possible on the basis of a correct conception of the human person. Right. So we need to reject this value neutral majoritarianism that ignores the rights of persons. And what St. John Paul II said easily turns into open or thinly disguised totalitarianism. So for your audience, as we move forward from the victory in Dobbs, I think we would do well to remember the words of Justice Robert Jackson, who wrote in one of his greatest Supreme Court opinions, "One's right to life may not be submitted to a vote. It depends on the outcome of no elections." So the audience takeaway here is that the foundational error of Roe wasn't that it just short-circuited the democratic process and denied states the ability to democratically decide how to deal with abortion. No, the foundational error of Roe was that it denied constitutional personhood and equal protection to the weakest and most vulnerable among us. And so I hope your audience draws inspiration from that and takes that message to the leaders, to their elected representatives, to push for equal protection, and to consider that as you vote in your states, that your state has an obligation to guarantee equal protection. It's not a right to decide up or down on abortion, like Stephen Douglas, who debated Lincoln, said, right? He said states should just be able to vote up or down on slavery. No, every state has an obligation to vote and to support equal protection for the unborn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, phenomenal. Josh Craddock with us today. What a blessing. We didn't get into any of the personal story, but there was a moment in time, I'm not sure what it was, when the light bulb came on for Josh on all of this, something that influenced him. I hope this show is that for you today, and we all start running forward, pushing for the end of abortion, abolish this ongoing daily mass murder of the preborn. The constitutionality in the 14th Amendment of the right to life for every preborn child is there. They need to be protected equally. We've got to push for it. Thank you so much, Josh Craddock. God bless you.